Hello, this Dating the Old Testament video is on the Book of Kings. Let me share my screen. Okay, 1st and 2nd Kings. The first thing that I should say about this is that 1st and 2nd Samuel and 1st and 2nd Kings, all 4 books together, are really one long and continuous account. It covers a very long time frame of about 1100 BC to 560 BC. And there's no noticeable break in the account where one book starts and another book ends. The 1st and 2nd divisions between 1st and 2nd Samuel and between 1st and 2nd Kings weren't originally there in the earlier Hebrew texts. Those divisions were made in the Middle Ages, and probably the reason that they divided them into 2 and that now they're present in 4 different books is due to just the limitations of a scroll size. If a scroll gets too big, it becomes unmanageable. So when dating a historical book like Kings or like 1st and 2nd Samuel's and 1st and 2nd Kings, it's usually best to start at the very end. So in this case, that would be the end of 2nd Kings. Now, authorship is always important because if we know the author, then that tells us very closely when the book was written. The Talmud assigns authorship of Kings to Jeremiah. Richard Friedman, who's a modern, more critical scholar and who doesn't always agree with the traditional standpoint, he agrees and says that it's Jeremiah who wrote it. And that is, I think, that's the right time frame. But the case that it was specifically Jeremiah being the writer, to me, that's unconvincing. Maybe it was, maybe it wasn't, but I agree that the time frame is right. Officially, the Book of Kings is anonymous. There's nowhere inside the book that it says who wrote it. This is the very ending of 2nd Kings. So this would be the last historical thing that we know about. It's after the fall of Jerusalem and a little ways into the exile, and it says this. And in the 37th year of the exile of Jehoiakim, king of Judah, in the 12th month, in the 27th day of the month, Evil-Merodach, king of Babylon, in the year that he began to reign, graciously freed Jehoiakim, king of Judah, from prison, and he spoke kindly to him and gave him a seat above the seats of the kings who were with him in Babylon. So Jehoiakim put off his prison garments. In every day of his life, he dined regularly at the king's table, and for his allowance, a regular allowance was given him by the king according to his daily needs as long as he lived. And that is the end of the book. That's the 37th year of Jehoiakim, and that's about 560 BC. That date is very close to accurate. Just within a year or two, that's the date, 560 BC. The ending of Kings, of course, could not have been written before that. But we also have good confidence that the Kings could not have been ended much after that either. That's not always the case. You know, a historical book could be written long after the fact, but in this case, we can be pretty sure that it wasn't. And this is why. Kings gives no hint of the things that are about to happen just in the next 25 years, really momentous events. Those would include the fall of Babylon and Cyrus' decree allowing the Jews to return to Judah and rebuild the temple, but there's nothing in Kings that mentions that or that even gives a hint that it knows that something like that is coming. So because of that, we can say that Kings was completed around 550 BC before those things happened. And so like 550 C is pretty close to the date, give or take maybe 10 years and not more than that. And happily, we can say that there's really little disagreement on that date, either between traditional scholars or more critical scholars. However, I believe that 2 Kings 24 and 25, the way that the book ends, and maybe as far as back as 2 Kings 23, 26, is actually an epilogue written later than the rest of the book. It was kind of a long epilogue, and here's why I think that that's the case. That second part or that epilogue, it describes the death of Josiah and the last three kings, the Babylonian exile and the last three kings. So this is also anonymous, but it'll be written by an anonymous second author, not the same person probably who wrote the first part of the majority part of Kings. The primary author, who's also anonymous, wrote up through 2 Kings 23-25. And so this is during the reign of Josiah, and it's before Josiah died. So that would place the writing of almost all of Kings in the reign of Josiah between 640 and 609 BC. How do we know that? How do we know that the anonymous primary author was writing a little before the end of the book and that he was during the reign of Josiah? Well, we have a number of clues. This anonymous primary author has a very specific formula he follows when he's describing all the kings. He compares all the kings of Judah to David, sometimes favorably and sometimes unfavorably. It's about 50-50, but they all get compared to David. And he evaluates them all on the basis of whether or not they remove the high places. Those will be high places of worship. It would be better to remove those and centralize all the worship in Jerusalem. And some kings leaned in that direction and most did not. And he evaluates every king based on whether or not they did that. And he also mentions their entries in what he calls the Book of the Chronicles of the Kings of Judah. That's what the author does about every king. Now, the second author, who covers the last three kings after Josiah, Josiah actually gets mentioned as far as the Chronicles of the Kings of Judah, but Josiah is not, after that, he doesn't compare the last three kings to David, and he doesn't evaluate the last three kings on removing the high places. So this author is not writing in quite the same way. And how do we know more about it's Josiah specifically? This pictures of the death of Josiah, by the way. Josiah is the last king that's judged by the common standard, which we mentioned before. 2 Kings has a lot of detail on Josiah. And finally, Josiah's name is used all the way back toward the beginning of the account in Kings. Let's go back to 300 years earlier. This is in 1 Kings 13, long before Josiah lived. The kingdom has just been split between the northern kingdom of Israel and the southern kingdom of Judah. And the king of the northern kingdom, Jeroboam, their first king, has built an altar far separate from Jerusalem that he's going to use, and the people are going to begin practicing a unfortunate form of syncretic worship there. And a prophet goes up there and it says this: "And the man cried against the altar by the word of the Lord and said, O altar, altar, thus says the Lord, behold, a son shall be born to the house of David, Josiah by name, and he shall sacrifice on you the priests of the high places who make offerings on you, and human bones shall be burned on you." So there you have Josiah's name 300 years before. So I think that's another hint that this book was actually written during the reign of Josiah. And finally, there are a lot of conditions that are described in the book of 1st and 2nd Kings that are conditions existing to this day. And this is a list of those. The 1 Kings 8:8, it says, the poles holding the Ark of the Covenant in the inner sanctuary, that's in the temple, are there to this day. Galilee cities are called Kabul to this day. Now, this day is obviously the day that the writer is writing. So Solomon made Canaanites forced laborers to this day. Almond trees are supports for the temple. Israel's in rebellion against the house of David. Waters of Jericho are purified, and on down the list. Those are all conditions which exist at the time that the writer is writing. Well, we can be pretty sure that to this particular day cannot apply to the time of the Babylonian exile, where the very, very ending of 2 Kings is, where the second writer writes, because in the Babylonian exile, a lot of those conditions wouldn't have existed, like all the ones that I lined through. The Ark of the Covenant was not in the inner sanctuary after the Babylonians had burned the temple down. Solomon, there weren't likely to be Canaanite forced laborers because all the elite Israelites had been deported. Almond trees supporting the temple because the temple had been burned down. Israel in rebellion against the house of David because the house of David had fallen, and Edom in revolt against Judah because Judah had fallen. So those are all indications that this day, when the writer of Kings says this day, it's not yet the Babylonian exile. But all of those things would actually fit if the book was written in a time of Josiah. Since the writer is writing about things that happened quite a long time before he lived, he used some sources for his writing. First were royal record books. And like this is in one example, it says this about every king. Now the rest of the acts of Jeroboam, how he warred and how he reigned, behold, they are written in the book of the Chronicles of the Kings of Israel. And if you're in the southern kingdom of Judah, it will say, now the rest of the acts of Rehoboam and all that he did, are they not written in the book of the Chronicles of the Kings of Judah? Now, if the word Chronicles rings a bell for you there a little bit, this is not the book of Chronicles that we have in the Bible. That was written a fair bit of time after the book of Kings, and Chronicles doesn't have hardly anything at all to say about the kings of Israel, the northern kingdom. And while it has a fair amount to say about the kings of Judah, it's got less than the book of Kings. The book of the Chronicles of the Kings of Israel and the book of the Chronicles of the Kings of Judah are a way of saying that those are the royal records that were maintained and by the king. And apparently the author of the book of Kings here had access to those records. So he used those as a source for writing the book of Kings like we have today. A second important source was Isaiah. Now, in the list of all the kings of Judah, there's a fair amount in there about Josiah, who's the king when the author is writing. And before that, there's a fair amount about King Hezekiah. And I think the main reason is that Hezekiah was king at a time when, well, it was a very important time, but it was also a time when Isaiah was writing, and the author of Kings has access to the book of Isaiah. Compare this. This is 2 Kings 19:21. As soon as King Hezekiah heard it, he tore his clothes and covered himself with sackcloth and went into the house of the Lord. And then this is Isaiah 37:1, and it says exactly the same thing. And the account in Isaiah parallels pretty closely to 2 Kings. It's not always word for word, but in a lot of cases, it is exactly word for word. And that would imply that the author of 2 Kings had Isaiah there in front of him and was able to use that as a source for writing Kings. And finally, there's the Elijah and Elisha accounts. You know, we don't think about it very much, but in the book of Kings, all of the history has to come through the kingdom of Judah and Jerusalem eventually. Things that happened in the northern kingdom of Israel are not likely to be preserved because they were conquered earlier on by the Assyrians. They eventually become the Samaritans. The canon of the Old Testament was developed and maintained by the Jews who came from the southern kingdom of Judah and Jerusalem. So in order for a northern kingdom account to come into the Bible, it has to come in through the southern kingdom. Well, Elijah and Elisha are northern prophets. And the book of Kings has not a lot to say about what happens in northern Israel. It has a brief mention of all the northern kings, but other than that brief mention, it doesn't say much about them unless they interact with the southern kingdom. But a huge exception is the accounts of Elijah and Elisha. They're northern Israel accounts, and they're very long and detailed. And we tend to think of them as stories of Elijah and Elisha, and they are. But the big theme of that part of Kings is it's a description of the destruction of the Baal cult, of the false religion of Baal. And that was very important because in Judah and the southern kingdom, right before Josiah, the king that they had before him was Manasseh, and he kind of revived the Baal cult. And so including this story in Kings about the destruction of the Baal cult very much matches something that would have been needed to have been written down during the time of Josiah. So somebody wrote that probably in the northern kingdom of Israel, and it got propagated to eventually to the book of Kings. So in conclusion, I believe that First and Second Kings was primarily written during the reign of Josiah, between 640 and 609. And Josiah was only 8 years old when he first became king, and it was a little bit later on that he began his reforms. And so it's likely that the book was written in the latter part of Josiah's reign after his reforms had already begun. The ending of Second Kings, which has the last three kings in the Babylonian exile, are kind of a long epilogue written between 560 and 538 BC, somewhat later than the rest of First Kings. So that's the conclusion I've got on the book of Kings. Now, like I said, Samuel is part of Kings, part of the same account, but I'm going to cover that in a separate video. And we should mention before I leave Kings that there are a couple other books in the Bible that use Kings. First and Second Chronicles draws on it very, very heavily. They have many parallel passages. And also Jeremiah 52 is pretty close replication of the account in Kings that describes the fall of Jerusalem and the Babylonian exile. So that's the story about Kings. Later on, I'm going to do another video on First and Second Samuel, and that will be the next one that I do. So that's the story on Kings. Thank you for watching. Before too long, I'll go ahead and publish a video on Samuel as well.